Hello everyone. So this is going to be a very quick video. Um, so presumably we are now more or less ready with a polished pencil design for our final projects. I'm sure there'll be some more editing here and there, and we are of course emailing back and forth about it as you work. But once you do have a really polished version of your design, then it's time to start thinking really rigorously about color. And the first step for thinking about the color would be to review some of the principles about the color that are described on the sheet. We know that the color is very open-ended for this piece, but we also know that we have discussed a lot of different ideas about what color can do. I suggest looking back over your past pieces and thinking about the various interesting color effects we've gotten. Um, and there's just some general principles offered in the assignment sheet instructions about having colors be more limited, um, so that you don't have necessarily a huge rainbow effect, which can be a little bit messy looking in the end if you have many different hues from all over the hue wheel all around your piece. Usually a more restricted color palette is going to be a better bet, especially the more complex your design gets. If you have a drawing-wise complex design, oftentimes it is better to have a simpler approach to the color along with that. Um, Also, something else that's emphasized is the idea of thinking about value, of course, right? So one thing you could do is, as you're sketching your piece, to maybe if you have one little side small sketch of it, to do a little shading to find the light and dark zones in your piece. Because as we know, in a way, what is light and what is dark is a more important question than what is red versus green. Um, we saw that with our portrait pieces that the lights and darks are what give the piece its three-dimensionality or its realism. So figuring out the light and darks, the value relationships of your piece is going to be the first most important thing. Um, and then what I'd like you to do is create, like we see on the left here, a color study where you give a try at making a very simplified version of your piece. Not as many shapes, maybe not as many colors, but the major colors and the major elements so that you can think through visually what your color relationships are going to be. So let's talk through the specifics of this. Um, so this is the final assignment color study. Now that you've developed a design for your final project, create a color study. Make this study about 4 by 5 inches and leave space for 1-inch border. Now create a highly simplified version of your large design using between 5 and 10 shapes. It's a good rule of thumb. It's not an exact thing. Paint these shapes with the major colors you intend to use in each section of the design. As you're working on the color palette, remember, a good rule of thumb is to limit the piece to no more than 3 hues. This isn't an absolute rule at all, but it's kind of a starting place. And to be clear, if you have a limited number of hues, that doesn't mean that you only have a limited number of colors. Let's remember that difference between the word hues and the word colors. When we're in our class, when we talk about colors, we talk about any difference counts as 2 different colors. So if you have one blue, then you have another blue that's slightly lighter or slightly lower intensity, that's 2 different colors, right? So just want to be clear on that. Your piece may have many, many different mixtures, but maybe it is going to be limited somewhat in how many different hues from around the hue wheel it has. You don't want the piece to end up looking like a rainbow mess. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this. One student is working on a design that involves a rainbow motif in one case, like there's an actual rainbow in the piece. Obviously, in that case, using all the hues of the hue wheel is important for that rainbow element. But maybe along with that, you make other decisions about limiting the color palette of the rest of the piece around that rainbow so that that rainbow really stands out as a distinct thing, etc. So um, general principle, start with reduced narrow palette of hues, um, and only get super duper colorful if there's really a specific reason to. Um, limiting the palette is usually going to make things look better. So again, as we've just said, construct value relationships carefully. What will be light, what will be dark in the piece? That is really the most crucial thing about your colors relationships. If you are trying to have a sense, especially of real light in your piece, or you're trying to have a sense of three-dimensionality, those issues will be very important. So again, you might want to do a little very loose sketching on the side where you're shading in different zones, various lightness and darkness levels, even before you start painting your little color study here. Some other things to think about with color. Consider hue proportion, which hue or hues will cover most of the space and which will serve as focal points. Oftentimes in a design, it's going to feel better to have unequal amounts of different hues. Like if you have a design that has red, green, and blue in it, oftentimes having equal amounts of your major colors, it's going to feel a little bit unsettled. It's going to feel a little bit awkward often. Many times it is good, just like with our first collage piece that we did way back at the beginning of the semester, to have an unequal balance between your hues. That in a funny way, that feels more balanced to have an unequal amount of hues. Like if you have a mostly blue world with then focal points of red or something like that, that is often going to feel much more effective than having kind of equalish amounts of your different colors. So when I say hue proportion, often what that's going to mean is having unequal proportions between your hues is usually the better bet. There's, of course, as we've said, exceptions to everything, but these are starting points to work with. And of course, this last point here, consider using lower intensity colors alongside higher intensities to give the color palette a richness and depth. At this point in the semester, we've done a ton of mixing. We understand all the rich variety of colors that can be generated from our palette of what start out of the tube as high intensities, but can become a huge range of browns and muddy colors, various low intensity colors, tints, tones, and shades of various kinds. So that is the major things here. Now, one thing to see with this little study here, it doesn't specify this on the sheet, but I think it's often a good idea to just make this into a polygonal design. Notice all these shapes are polygonal shapes. That's not required, but I have found that oftentimes the color studies that come out nicest do use that strategy because it kind of gives things a crisp, geometric, abstract niceness to them. So consider that. Consider making your color study entirely out of polygonal shapes, but it's not an absolute thing. It isn't required. Let's see. So we've talked about the major elements of the color study, and I think that we should be good with that. So looking forward to see these. Oftentimes these color studies really do come out very nicely. Sometimes there have been cases where people like their color studies better than their final piece. But we'll see what happens. The other thing too is if in the end you make a color study and you feel like you've done some things wrong, like the colors aren't relating to each other in the way you wanted them to, of course you can edit them on the color study. But of course, also in the end, you may end up with a piece where the colors have changed a little bit from your color study. This is totally natural because the whole entire point is to learn from the color study to really clarify what might be sort of a little vague in your own mind as you're thinking about it, and make some good moves that will help you as you move to your final piece. All right.